Good afternoon. I'm Tom Jackson, and it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Jennifer Bickham Mendez, Associate Professor of Sociology at the College of William and Mary, where she won the President's Award for Service to the Community and the Paul Mary Award for Faculty Excellence. She writes about how political and economic structures shape people's everyday lives, their own struggles for economic justice, their search for social inclusion in a globally interconnected world. She's published and presented widely about women's workers' movements in Nicaragua, house cleaners in Northern California, a campus living wage campaign in Virginia. And for 5 years, she has co-directed a program in border studies. They guide students and faculty far from the borders of William and Mary down to the US-Mexico border. They meet humanitarian groups in both countries, deported immigrants, Border Patrol agents, federal immigration officials, public defenders, activists, and give them an experiential education. Her book, From the Revolution to the Maquiladoras, Gender, Labor, and Globalization in Nicaragua, won the 2008 Annual Book Award from the Political Economy of the World System section of the American Sociological Association. She's co-edited a forthcoming anthology entitled Border Politics, Social Movements, Collective Identity, and Globalization. I've just been reading some of the preliminary work, and it really is beautifully done, how she shows that the border is not simply down south. It's in 1,000 communities where people who do the bottom jobs, the hard work of our society, try to negotiate what they need for themselves and their families. So today she shares the results from a 10-year ethnographic study in a talk entitled Newcomers in the Cradle of a Nation, Mexican and Central American Immigrants in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Thank you. I don't think I took that. So, yeah. So I think this is on now. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Tom, and thank you all for coming. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I want to acknowledge and thank the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities for giving me the opportunity to basically come to what is sort of an academic's utopia and soak up the very vibrant intellectual environment that is there and do it with a lot of other great people. So thank you, Rob Vaughn, Jeannie Seiler, and Ann Reed. I also want to publicly thank Gay Fricks, who gave me a place to live so that I could complete this residency. And there's a saying in Spanish, and I'm told by my Jewish friends also in Yiddish, that relatives and the dead share one thing in common. After 3 days, things start to smell bad. But that has not been the case, I think, for her. So I hope, I don't know, but I'm very appreciative of that. And I want to also thank my husband, Chuck Bailey, who's in the audience today. And without his work on the home front, I also could not have participated in this. So I'm very grateful to him. So I'll go ahead and start. It's a sunny morning in Williamsburg, Virginia, and Hugo is glad that the rain has cleared. He is eager to get back to work, completing home repairs in Queen's Landing, a gated community located a few miles from the motel room that he has called home for the last 4 years. Most of the tourists have checked out, and the motel owner, who allows Hugo to live rent-free in exchange for his work as a handyman, has just turned off the no vacancy sign. But Hugo is more concerned about a police car patrolling the street outside. He has been stopped by the police just a few weeks prior, and when he failed to produce a Virginia driver's license, for which he is ineligible as an undocumented immigrant from Honduras, the officer had warned him that the next time his car would be towed. Ni modo, he told me with a shrug later when I asked him if he still drove. What can I do? I have to work. Down the street, Rosario, sporting her country inn smock, has just enough time to run an errand before starting her shift cleaning hotel rooms. She passes a gas station where a middle-aged white man decked out in full 18th century costume, complete with the iconic tri-corner hat, is filling his car with gas. He could even be talking on his cell phone while he's doing it. Like Rosario, he is on his way to work, but as a historic interpreter at Colonial Williamsburg, where he will reenact what daily life was like in the capital of the British colony. Rosario doesn't really have time to pay him much attention, and she's never been to CW, as we locals call it. She hurries on her way to the Hispanic grocery store, where she will wire money to her mother in her home village in Oaxaca, Mexico. The coffee harvest is finished long ago, and it's time to pay for her children's school uniforms and supplies. So these are just two scenarios taken from, composites really, taken from my field research over the last 10 years in Williamsburg, Virginia. And scenes like these became increasingly predominant in the early 2000s and continue today. So what I would like to do today is just share with you a few highlights from what has been many years of research. I won't bore you with the stuff that sociologists like to talk about, like methods, but I'm certainly happy to entertain questions in the Q&A. Most of my time I'll spend providing kind of a window to you all about the settlement experiences of this group of newcomers to what sociologists call a non-traditional settlement site, Williamsburg, Virginia, where I've lived for the last 15 years. In the early 2000s, when I began this project, newcomers from Latin America were just beginning to gain public visibility. And social services, law enforcement, teachers were rather caught off guard by this demographic shift. And agencies approached me and asked for my support in addressing the needs and helping them understand in order to address the needs of their new clients, and also including assistance providing interpretation services. So I ended up conducting participant observation, a method usually associated with anthropologists, but I'm a qualitative sociologist, so I deal with people's stories, not the numbers. But I've learned about numbers, so you'll see a few of those today. So I was able to conduct this participant observation and interviews alongside volunteer activities, mostly with a group of agencies really, but mostly with a family assistance program that I'll call VPITCH. I'm going to use acronyms all day today. I mean acronyms that are pseudonyms, that aren't the true names. I can tell you more about what all this research included, including informal and formal interviews that my students and I conducted with service providers, police officers, court officials, victims advocates, along with immigrants, right? One final note is that in 2005 and 2006, three of my research students and I, we were able to travel to 4 different home communities of immigrants who live in Williamsburg as, at their invitation, were welcomed into their communities. So I was able to conduct interviews within the communities back in southern and central Mexico. Okay, so as many of you know, Williamsburg is located on the coastal plain of Virginia, about 2 hours northwest of here. Since the 1950s, this picturesque small town has been a popular historic tourist destination. But growth beginning in the 1980s and into the 1990s really transformed this small town. Rapid residential and commercial development ensued, gathering speed during the booming 90s. In large part, this growth was stimulated by the rebranding of the area as an upscale retirement destination, which was then growth was sustained by the housing bubble, okay, in the early 2000s. So affluent seniors from states in the north could sell their modest homes, escape high taxes, and buy a McMansion located in a newly constructed high-end residential subdivision, maybe a gated community, maybe right even on a premier golf course. And this domestic, what rural sociologists call amenity migration, the internal migration looking for quality of life, or retiree migration, helped sustain and galvanize growth and also contributed to a demand for services, okay? In the early 2000s, the prices of homes soars, public concerns turn to the shortage of affordable housing. Maybe those of you from Charlottesville, this might sound a bit familiar, okay? Wages in the area remain extremely low, only enough to cover about 1/3 of what it would cost to buy a single family dwelling. Now these have evened out now as during the recovery after the recession. So Williamsburg underwent this transformation from a small town into what you might call a suburb with no city. And I think these are my key words when I went to in thinking about it more recently. It's a wealthy, low-wage community. So the difference between wealth and income, earned income, is the gap is wide in Williamsburg. And that's where Latino immigration fits into this community because of the demand for services. So beginning in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, we see the unprecedented arrival of immigrant newcomers, mostly from Mexico and Central America, who found employment in the growing number of low-wage, low-skill jobs in hotels and restaurants. The population of Hispanics, today I'm going to use the labels Hispanics and Latinos interchangeably, like the Pew Research Center does, and like the census has begun to do. We can talk about that decision in the Q&A too. It's a political decision. It's, anyway, something else to discuss. So the population increased over 700% between 1990 and 2010 to just under 5% of the population. We're talking about 5,000 people if we think about greater Williamsburg, not the entire of York County, those of you who are familiar with the area. To put 5,000 people in perspective, that's just a little less than every year we have the influx of our students into Williamsburg, just like you all will in August here in Charlottesville. So it's kind of like that influx, just a few less. Williamsburg shares many attributes with other new immigrant destinations across the country because this is part of shifting immigration streams that began occurring in the 1990s, where immigrant newcomers were locating and settling in areas that have not seen, were not used to, groups of folks who didn't speak English and were unaccustomed to these newcomers. Like these kinds of new destinations, many immigrant newcomers arrived in Williamsburg directly from their home communities. That means that their experiences adapting to their new cultural and social surroundings were occurring for the first time in Williamsburg. Williamsburg lacks a long-standing pre-existing ethnic enclave, okay? It's not New York. It's not LA, okay? So there's no pre-existing group or community that can that could help ease the transition of adapting to these new surroundings. Many hail from rural communities and lack schooling beyond elementary school. And as I've already mentioned, social services, the social service infrastructure was ill-equipped to accommodate this group. There are some other similarities as well. Like other rapidly changing communities in the South, as this group of newcomers gained increased visibility, negative attitudes about Hispanics, sometimes Mexicans, used interchangeably, sometimes illegals, a conflation of these three terms, began to flood the editorial pages and public comment sections of the local paper, echoing in public forums as well. These public expressions of anti-immigrant sentiments echoed and parroted the rhetoric of media pundits like Lou Dobbs. They coalesced around two public anxieties: overrunning services, like this quote from the Virginia Gazette, and also lots of fear of crime. A final, I promise, related trend, we do love the trends in sociology, so sorry, that's important to understand, and this one really begins after the first 5 years of the 2000s, and it's relevant for understanding this case, is the array of local ordinances and policies that were proposed across the country, proposed and passed, that were aimed at restricting immigrants' access to county and local services. So these are like the Prince William County Resolution of 2007, if you remember that. Their second aim was to step up immigration enforcement at the local level. So we see a devolution of immigration enforcement from the purview of the federal government down to local communities. Williamsburg shared in this pattern, and local politicians in 2007 jumped on the immigration bandwagon, like Brenda Pogue, who's still one of our delegates. And as you can see, her ad and her campaign brochure that was mailed to everybody in James City County was hailed with approval by a local columnist in our local paper, the Virginia Gazette. All right, so that's all background and context in some degree, but you still don't understand maybe the big question that everyone was asking me in 2003. You're a sociologist. What are these people doing here? And why now? Who are they? And that's what really drew me into this project. Well, the labor shortage is a big and important thing to understand, right? But labor shortage is only part of the equation. There also has to be filling that labor shortage. So labor recruitment is something else that occurred. With reports of labor shortage circulating in the local press, local employers cast their gaze in search of new sources of low-wage labor. Many use small staffing agencies to recruit workers the type of recruitment that went on didn't happen so much in local communities in Latin America that I've seen, mostly within traditional gateways like New York or other cities, or spreading the word in agricultural places like Florida amongst workers. Others made avail of federal programs like the H-2B guest worker program and the J-1 student visa exchange program. Manuel, originally from an agricultural village in Puebla, Mexico, saw an ad in a placement agency after traversing the border near Arizona and arriving in New York to stay with his brother. The restaurant offered him bus fare to Williamsburg, free housing, and a ride to work every day, often 6 days a week. He felt he couldn't pass up this opportunity. 6 years later, he was able to send for his wife and son. So chain migration and social networks are important to understand too. Once migration starts, people feel that they have a foothold in the community, they send for their family members. Andrea arrived from Veracruz, actually Jalapa, Mexico, along with a group of 7 other women. Her 8-month H-2B visa provided her with a work authorization card, and she was able to obtain a Social Security card. She shared a hotel room with another woman and a small kitchen with 6 others. For this, $300 a month was deducted from her wages. She met her husband, who was working in a restaurant nearby. They married, and she became pregnant. At that point, she decided to overstay her visa, even though she knew it meant losing her authorized status. Beyond labor recruitment, 2 other factors need to be taken into consideration when considering why non-traditional settlement sites became settlement sites in the late 90s and early 2000s. I'll just choose 2. There's one that I'm kind of leaving out, but I could talk about it in the Q&A. The 2001 earthquake devastated the local economy, especially for small-scale agricultural producers. 46,000 people had to be evacuated from their homes. Later that year, President George Bush granted temporary protective status to Salvadorans present in the U.S. This allowed them the opportunity to live and work in the U.S. temporarily, okay? Leonardo was a teenager when he came in 2002. It was a 14-day journey. It took him 14 days to travel from his rural hamlet in Santa Ana in El Salvador, accompanied by a guide, to the cost of $7,500 to his parents, to his family. 2 days after his arrival, he was at work at a seafood restaurant where his father had worked 3 years prior. They were both able to obtain temporary protective service status. But Leonardo lost his when he failed to renew in time. It takes money, there's a fee, and usually people want a lawyer to do it. International trade policies are another factor that's really important to consider. So in 1994, NAFTA was passed. And what NAFTA did was it eliminated agricultural subsidies in Mexico. But in the US, we kept our agricultural subsidies. And Mexico was, under the treaty, had to open its doors to foreign imports. So we produce a lot of corn in the United States. We produce so much corn, we don't know what to do with it. US growers flooded Mexico with cheap corn, and making it impossible for farmers like the ones I visited in 2005 to compete. So when my students and I visited this family, they no longer were planting their fields. Most everyone had emigrated. The guy on the left had been deported, so he was back. When I present my work to students and in the community, oftentimes people are perplexed and they wonder, how is it that illegal immigrants walk around openly in public without being taken into custody by the police? They think it's like America's Most Wanted, right? That you could call someone and say, hey, I just spotted a Mexican walking down the street. Police, come check it out. It doesn't quite work that way. The misconception, I think, comes from the term illegal and the criminalization tied to it. A 1929 law made it a crime to enter the United States at an unauthorized port of entry. So when I take students to the border, we gotta go in the right door. Otherwise, we would be committing a crime. However, presence in the interior without authorization is not a criminal offense. It is a civil matter, punishable not through the criminal justice system, although the criminal justice system has gotten increasingly involved, but with removal after immigration proceedings. And it's only more recently under these local ordinances that I already told you about that police have been accorded the authority to enforce immigration. Most of us in this room, without making assumptions, probably could not prove that you're US citizens right now. Your driver's license doesn't do it, unless you have your birth certificates on you right now or your passports. So that's the thing about identifying folks who are undocumented. It's something that law enforcement themselves does not want to necessarily be placed in the position to having to do, because you end up making assumptions about people. Okay, so getting beyond juridical definitions, immigration scholars are, like myself, are much more concerned with the social effects of illegality. Veronica, a young mother from Michoacan, summarized it well. She said to me, all our problems can be summarized with 2 words, language and papers. Illegality, or temporary immigration status, brings with it a constant sense of insecurity and anxiety. It also produces a group of people who are always already considered criminal, and the category of illegal is associated with a particular group of people. This means that although unauthorized immigrants are physically present in our neighborhoods and in our workplaces, they are legally non-existent, to quote Susan Kooten, or impossible subjects, to quote May Nye. There's your historian, Tom. And their lack of official identities becomes an obstacle for completing everyday activities that most of us take for granted, like getting a job, setting up a bank account, applying for a loan, obtaining your child's birth certificate. The group is legally barred from cash and food assistance and obtaining driver's license, except no longer in California, Utah, Maryland, and DC, where they are going to have driver's license specifically for undocumented folks. If they have disputes with their landlord, like Mariana did when her family's apartment became infested with bed bugs and the owners would not respond, she can't receive services from legal aid. You're ineligible. Ineligibility is one thing, but it's more precisely deportability that causes a climate of fear. The state of being deportable means that many mundane activities take on a high degree of risk, right? Driving your kid to school, commuting to work. And it creates a group of people who are unprotected, reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement, an essential ingredient to community policing, and vulnerable to labor and other abuses. And I could tell you about all kinds of problems that this can create. But in particular, deportability brings a special kind of terror to parents with children. It's almost a sense of everyday terror. They don't know what will happen to their children if they are detained by the police. The integrity of their family is already impacted by borders that separate them from loved ones, seems to be under constant threat, with their home lives policed by an endless array of rule enforcers. There seems to be no end to the ways that they can get in trouble. Fishing without a license, littering, open container alcohol rules, not sending a note to school with your child if she's sick. Dina, one of my research respondents, forbade her middle schooler from setting up a lemonade stand with his friends. She said, we don't want any problems. There might be rules against that. I have no idea, right? So this is the sense. A snippet from my field notes after a parent support group meeting in 2006. Did you hear about the couple who went to the laundromat and left the children in the car? The police came to take them away and said if they didn't call someone to pick up the kids, they would be taken to social services. Imagínate, they couldn't reach anyone except a neighbor they barely knew. In an effort to calm the fears of parents who were expressing reluctance to apply for services that their kids needed, the family assistance program that I worked with decided that we should bring a representative from Child Protective Services to our parent support group meeting. And somehow, I was in charge of finding this person, which I did. Miss Barnard was very kind, but she was very straightforward in her presentation to the mothers in the group. If your child is sick and you don't take them to the doctor, you can be arrested. Of course, kids get sick all the time with colds and stomach aches, but if the child is sick for an extended period of time and you don't take them to see a doctor, then you could have legal problems. And not speaking the language or not having transportation is no excuse. You need to know what you can do so we don't come to your house. An investigation you really don't want, then you could get into trouble. If you need help caring for your children, then you just call us. We are here to help. And at this point, Andrea from Jalapa raises her hand and she says, but in this case, if we call your office, is there someone there who speaks Spanish? Miss Barnard, that's what I called her, seemed flustered. No, I guess not. But we do have a computer program that we type in things and it gets translated. This did little to allay the fears of families. Women are reluctant to contact the authorities in cases of domestic violence. I could talk more about that. The fear is not that police will violate the Violence Against Women Act and will detain them. The fear is that they will detain the partner. Leaving them with no income. And this has to do with the social isolation that women in new non-traditional settlement sites often experience, particularly once they have kids. The high cost of childcare, the driver's license, which if somebody drives in the family, it's probably going to be the man. Also, the men would come first, so they've already established TPS and have already gotten a head start in kind of getting around. So the social isolation is a problem, as is car dependency, which increases the social isolation. So car dependency is something that causes a great deal of anxiety, and we know how dependent we are in rapidly growing areas like Charlottesville and Williamsburg on our cars because of the way that the growth is sprawling, right? You can't get around. So people drive to go to work, but they're constantly afraid, and they're also driving without having learned or without a permit. Latino immigrants have reason to fear encounters with police. Despite Obama's and ICE's stated commitment to focus deportation efforts on aggregated felons and other criminal defenders, deportations for minor offenses, including traffic violations, reached record numbers in 2012. 410,000 people were deported in 2012. According to the New York Times, 193,000 people have been deported after no infraction or minor infraction since Obama took office. The other issues that I wanted to tell you about are less visible, and they have to do with the world of women. So sometimes when we think about immigration, we have in our mind this notion of the guy who's going to come and pull his family up by the bootstraps. But women face particular obstacles when they lack immigration status or have temporary immigration status. Part of this has to do with the employment options for this group. In Williamsburg, like many sites in the South, employment options tend to be in seasonal jobs, low wages, no benefits, and highly variable hours. That makes the childcare part hard too. These sectors are also informalized, and employees are often paid in cash. This includes hotels, chain or not chain. H-2B workers are paid with a Social Security number and with cash. But what hotels will do is after the first round of H-2B, they can just hire people who overstayed their visas. Chain restaurants often do the same. And I'm not just talking about Williamsburg. I'm talking about this kind of thing happens across our country. So don't let me just focus on that part of the case study. While being paid under the table presents less of a problem for single men, although wage theft is also an issue, it becomes a serious issue for pregnant women and families who are trying to get food stamps and Medicaid benefits for their US-born children. Employers who hire undocumented workers are extremely reluctant to advertise this fact by providing documentation of the workers' pay. So if you've ever filled out a food stamp application or a Medicaid application, you can skip over the part where you verify your wages if you don't have a pay stub. There's a form that you can fill out and say, I have this income, but I can't verify it with a pay stub. But then the employer has to sign it, and how many employers really want to do that? Carolina, a caseworker for the Family Assistance Program, told me of many stories of people losing their jobs when they asked for this form to be filled out. At one point, an employer in Williamsburg was charging $30 for people to get a pay stub. Documenting expenses can also be difficult if the child care worker who takes care of your child is undocumented and doesn't want to provide a receipt. I'll skip this story and tell you some policy stories. So one of the things that I've been able to do while being here, here at VFH, is to really kind of dig a bit more into policy effects and trying to understand and get my mind around them a little bit more, rather than contextualizing people's stories within the policies. An important policy that increased these kinds of verification problems for undocumented immigrants was the 2005 Deficit Reduction Act, which doesn't sound like it has anything to do with immigration. But there was a provision within that act that was specifically aimed at making sure that people who are not eligible for Medicaid couldn't get it. So tightening those restrictions by requiring that everyone who has Medicaid or who would apply for Medicaid provide, what is the exact wording? Satisfactory documentary evidence of citizenship. It kind of reminds us of the voter ID laws in that this created, lots of studies came out to show how this created lots of hardship for the homeless, the elderly, and I'm particularly interested in immigrant mothers who are trying to document the citizenship of their US-born children. The 14th Amendment says that their children are US citizens. However, the regulations that came out from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid stated that newborns born in the US still needed to provide a birth certificate. So what is the problem with acquiring a birth certificate? Acquiring a birth certificate in the early years of immigration to new settlement sites like Williamsburg that are unaccustomed to cross-cultural communication, dealing with a population that may not be literate even in their own language, was a difficult bureaucratic maze. And I learned this firsthand from the agencies that help all mothers figure out how you get your birth certificate in the mail. You also need to have an address where your birth certificate is going to come. So families would jump in the car and drive to Richmond to get their baby's birth certificate, but the requirements for documentation to get your child's birth certificate resemble the DRA in that it's a hierarchy of documents. And most of them immigrant parents would not have, like an state-issued ID or a passport with a valid I-94. In that case, you can still get a birth certificate for your child, but you have to ask the hospital to provide you with a letter stating that your child was born in the hospital. So now you're an undocumented person, you're nervous about certain things. There also weren't good language accommodations at this time. This did create a lot of problems, and I'm glad that more recently these kinds of regulations have been backed off, but it is one of those sort of invisible hardships that the children of undocumented encounter. Of course, immigrant parents before or after DRA were not eligible for Medicaid. They're still not. However, their access to medical care was also impacted by the DRA. Because what happened was that for example, in Williamsburg, a local safety net clinic that served the uninsured passed a policy mirroring the DRA requirements for verifying identity in order to be eligible for the sliding scale of discounted medical insurance. Medical services. These medical services are particularly for the uninsured. Despite outreach efforts to assure Spanish-speaking patients that they would still be seen, the number of patient visits from Hispanics, which had grown steadily at almost an alarming rate, plateaued and fell. The cost of prenatal care in the new prenatal clinic went from $600 to double that. And in interviews, medical and healthcare providers worried that Latino folks were not returning for follow-up. And more importantly, from my position, from my interest, this policy put medical staff, often providers themselves, into the position of policing eligibility even during the medical visit. To me, that's directing resources away from the actual medical treatment and care towards what's your income, can you verify your income, who are you, can you verify your identity. Another issue that arises in sites like rapidly transforming and growing localities where immigration began in the 1990s are language accommodations, and more importantly, who's going to pay for the language accommodations when you have a group of newcomers who don't speak English. County social services, schools, and agencies that worked with children slowly but at a steady rate began to hire Spanish speakers on their staff. And schools would pay for trained and certified interpreters. In fact, I just went to kindergarten registration with a couple of moms who asked me to accompany them. And there was a trained and certified interpreter there. So I was like, wow, things are changing. But hospitals and clinics were slower in this regard, particularly because the emergency room sees a lot. There's a lot more demand, and there's a lot more of an impact on their budgets. While the hospital implemented a phone service, which is at least a screened person on the other end, however, when I was in labor, if somebody gave me the telephone, anyway. But the safety net clinic decided to use volunteer interpreters to work the phones and even to interpret during appointments. So staffing, they did the best they could, but staffing was spotty. You couldn't guarantee that you could be there and get an appointment when there was an interpreter. And interpreters were not and continue not to be screened for fluency or ability. Patients were told that they had to come with their own interpreters, and in many cases were turned away if they did not have an interpreter with them. And this led to all kinds of almost comical problems with the intake process to this day. Receptionists continue to be monolingual. Carolina, a worker from this family assistance program, was frustrated when her client returned from a medical appointment at the prenatal clinic. What good is a translator that the patients can't understand, she asked me, when she discovered that Veronica had actually been diagnosed with gestational diabetes but had no idea. The spotty language accommodations in the safety net clinic added to the constellation of logistical arrangements, documents, and resources that immigrant newcomers needed to muster in order to gain access to medical care there. You needed a ride, an available interpreter, permission to take off work, cash in your hand, and the proper documentation of wages and forms of ID. The bureaucratic requirements were so onerous that my students and I assisted women who sent for prescription medications from El Salvador, and I really have only met people from El Salvador who did this, in order to self-medicate, including 2 women we met who were injecting themselves with Depo-Provera or having friends or families do it. These same kinds of issues have made cash-only bodega clinics a prevalent site in Latino neighborhoods in LA and other cities, and this according to the Kaiser Family Health Foundation. Beyond this, sparse language accommodation created a sense of desperation for some patients seeking care, as I'm sure you could imagine. In an interview, Lila from Guatemala told me about this, and her medical visit with a nurse practitioner who spoke some Spanish, but very limited. And she was having terrible abdominal pain at the time. And so she's recounting this in an interview with me. And she said, but tell me, what is the matter? Like I was supposed to tell her in English. But what do I know about how to say the parts of the body in English? So what I did that day, I was mad. I just said, okay, thank you. And she said that in English. And I turned and left. But I felt very, very bad from this experience because they are like this with us, the Hispanics. And well, they should help us because we are human beings. We are not animals. I don't know why they behave that way, really, because it's not just me. I don't know how many more people have gone through this. Okay, so insufficient language accommodations persisted at the Safety Net Clinic despite the initiation of a medical interpretation program that would provide free trained interpreters for a designated period before charging for services, and despite Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which stipulates that agencies that receive federal money implement systems to provide meaningful access to services to people of limited English proficiency, LEPs. This healthcare center's administration directed resources and staff and energy to ensuring compliance with DRA, but seemed less concerned with Title VI. In a way, these policies are at cross purposes, right? Do we treat Latino patients as undocumented and undeserving, or as LEP patients who are being discriminated against if we fail to provide language accommodations? These patients are both. They're undocumented and they're LEP. But in a federal policy context that had become decidedly hostile, to quote a 2009 study, to unauthorized immigrants, this local agency and its board of directors opted to treat them like the former. And it does have to be contextualized within that policy context. All right, by way of conclusion, I'm going to tell you about a more happy scene, a more recent scene that was about a year ago, and end by talking a bit about the demographic impact of immigration on receiving countries like the United States. So it's almost about a year ago exactly today, I was invited to a 2-year-old's birthday party by a Salvadoran family. The apartment was full of 8 adults and probably 10 kids. The language inside was completely in Spanish. There's birthday presents, all the kids are dressed up, but it's also hot and stuffy in this 2-bedroom apartment. So I suggested we go outside, and the kids were all happy. Oh, we're gonna go outside. So I went outside, and instantly the world changed, and it became a bilingual world. The older kids immediately shifted to perfect English and pulled out their screens, their handheld devices. And the younger ones started chasing each other, playing tag. They wanted me to play with them. Vamos a jugar a duck goose, they told me. I considered Orlando, who I've known since he was born, a bright and spunky 4-year-old, had just finished his first year at Head Start. His mother had told me that he was quite beside himself last year because he realized that the school year was coming to a close. Head Start ends in May, it doesn't go all the way into June. And so every day that summer, he asked his mother, "Y la escuela, the school, when would it be time to go back to school?" Often you hear the term anchor babies used to refer to children of the undocumented, referring to them as some sort of a long-range settlement strategy. But I think these children of deportable, undocumented parents raise not only age-old questions about the assimilation of the second generation, but are an important reminder of the indelible impact that immigration makes on the demographics of receiving countries. The big message from the 2010 census was that most of the nation's population increase from 2000 to 2010, 56% was attributable to births in the Hispanic population, which increased at 4 times the rate of whites. Consider this. According to the Pew Hispanic Center, 24% of all children under the age of 18 are Hispanic, 1 in 4. That's not Hispanic multiple, that's people who are checking just one race, Hispanic, that ethnicity, Hispanic. Consider this. More Latino children are living in poverty than children of any other racial or ethnic group. In 2010, 37.3% of poor children were Latino. And there's my sociology, my graph. This is taken from a study by Fraze, a demographer at the Brookings Institution. And what you can see there is the green line that dips down. The growth of the population 0 to 18 of Latino Hispanic is almost exactly the same as the decline in whites. So the face of children in this country is becoming a face of Latino kids. More than 2/3 of the 6.1 million Latino kids who are living in poverty are children of immigrant parents. And last factoid, by 2060, according to the US Census, Latinos will reach 31% of the population. To me, these statistics raise an important question about what our society will be like as we head toward being a minority-majority country in 2050. Will passive economic mobility and full integration be open or closed to kids like Orlando, who are growing up with undocumented parents? I had to cover his eyes because this is on TV. And this really shows how the issue of immigration gets to the core of not only who we are, but who we will become as a nation. Whether or not we decide that more border security efforts are a necessary piece of immigration reform does not change the fact that this latest wave of immigration has already shaped the future of our country and our communities. What remains to be seen is what kind of society we will construct in the years ahead. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming. We have time for questions and answers. Well, yes, questions and answers, exactly. Who's first?
Jennifer, thank you. It's all very interesting and difficult to get one's mind around. Presumably, one would think in a better world, perhaps, that the employer, we depend upon these people, and obviously agricultural communities maybe even more so than in Williamsburg. Has there been any movement from the employer side to help resolve a myriad of problems that you're identifying, or do the employers simply view this as someone else's problem?
In the absence of regulation, there's always good-hearted people who want to do the right thing. But in the absence of regulation, there's also a lack of protection, right? So there are workers who don't need those protections because they work for somebody like, I won't say his name, but an employer in a landscaping company who has always been very careful to follow the regulations of H-2B and provide adequate housing to his temporary workforce and to follow all the rules. In the employer's defense, if you decide you're going to do that and everybody else is hiring an undocumented workforce that's willing to work for less, you're in trouble. So, you know, there are, I guess, structural issues here, right? And it is, I think, maybe easy to point the finger, and maybe I was doing it a little bit in my talk, you know, these particular bad employers. But I think really what it needs to be looked at, like my friend Cindy Hahamovich at William and Mary, and if you want to take a look at a fantastic study, look at her latest book, No Man's Land, where she looks at temporary worker programs across the world, focusing on Jamaica, and the H-2B and H-2A programs in the United States. Immigration reform, one of the things that's proposed is a W visa. And the W visa would not be, for the first time, would allow a pathway to the United States, not citizenship, that is not tied to a particular employer. And that, I think, is a very good idea. And it has been hailed by immigration rights advocacy groups as well as labor organizers and employers as a good thing.
Okay, that's a bright note.
Jennifer, my mother lives in San Diego. She has many Mexican neighbors. And one day, a teenager from next door knocked on her door and said, would she drive him somewhere to do with his car? And they went there, but then he was told he needed to go to the police. And perhaps rather foolishly, he did.
They went.
And there they, said, you're undocumented, you're going to Mexico. And my mom had to go home alone and tell his mother that what happened. And the mother kind of shrugged and said he'll be back. And sure enough, he he was, like in a matter of 7 to 10 days, let's say. So here's what confuses me. For one thing, you know, you quote that number about how many were deported in 2012, the year this, let's say this happened. And I'm thinking, I wonder how many are counted over and over again, because it seems so easy for him to come back. But on the other hand, we read these stories about people who pay incredible amounts of money, risk being suffocated in a truck. So I get a little confused about how can it be so hard for some people and so easy for others.
Well, it has gotten increasingly difficult since the 1990s with Operation Safeguard in Arizona and Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego. Border fortification really happened a great deal in the 90s around where your friend was in San Diego, with the express purpose of keeping folks out. But that border is long, and I've been to it. There's plenty of places to cross, and people cross all the time, every day. And every day, some are deported, and every day some. Right now, immigration from Mexico is at 0. And that doesn't mean that undocumented immigration to the U.S. is at 0. It means that more people are leaving, so it evens out. Why can some people get across and others can't? I mean, like I read you the story of Leonardo made it in 14 days. I mean, it has to do with your connections, how good your guide is, where you live on the other side, how familiar you are maybe with the route yourself. I would want to know where your friend was from. If your friend was from one of these, the other piece of the story that I didn't talk about is that sending communities have also gone national in Mexico. So it used to be, it was very concentrated under the Bracero program. You would have particular sending states. Mexico is also a federation like we are. So Jalisco, Guerrero, Michoacan were big sending states. And now you have people coming in concentrated numbers from new sending states, like Puebla, like the picture I showed, and Oaxaca, and southern Mexico. People are poorer, less educated, more vulnerable. So those are the kinds of things. Many things shape the immigration experience. Your gender, how much money you have, who your connections are. And so those would be the kinds of things I would want to ask to find out why it was so easy for your friend. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was really great. I loved hearing about everything. I'm really interested in the irony of this being colonial Williamsburg and whether, you know, sort of how you write about that or how people, maybe white people who've lived in Williamsburg for a while would think about that. I mean, they're reminded daily that they too came, and so, you know, maybe it was 350 years ago, but does nobody ever sort of think, I mean, why should people now not be able to do what ancestors to people who'd lived in Williamsburg did then? I mean, I'm just really interested in that irony of the location where you're having your case study, and are people aware of that when they see all the tri-corner hats or not?
I think that one answer to that question is that just about everybody in Williamsburg is a transplant like me. And so James City County now, 20% of James City County is age 60 and older. So this retiree migration is important to understand. What are retirees looking for? Many, my husband's in the audience, he remembers this dinner that we went to, and I was taking field notes afterwards because I was listening to a group of retirees talk about why they had decided to settle in Williamsburg. And a lot of it was to enjoy the natural beauty, to enjoy all the programming at Colonial Williamsburg, to enjoy the very, I think, excellent program that William and Mary has for retirees, and to escape the crime, and to escape the city, and to escape these markers of what it means to be in a more urban area, and escape the taxes too. And so, you know, this is like, I can't, kind of one attitude of one group might be, I came here to get away from all that stuff. You know, and I could show you some really interesting quotes. I have a study that my colleague Dinesh Sahoni and I published a couple of years ago that's a content analysis of the local paper, because the local paper between 2005 and 2007 was really a fascinating thing to read, the Virginia Gazette, in how immigration was talked about. It was on every page, it was just the hot button issue in the local setting. And there were lots of quotes where people were writing into the public comment section about, we better watch out, I came here from somewhere else and these problems started, and before you know it, they're coming, they're here with the cars on the lawn. And that's not everybody, but that does exist. And, from perspective of my parents retired in Williamsburg, and yeah, they're looking for a nice place to retire. And maybe in people's interpretation of what that means. That's not to say that there aren't people who volunteer with the very agencies that I've worked with. And then the other aspect I would say is that Williamsburg does not celebrate a history of immigration, and it's only recently that the history of forced migration has been taken into consideration, and it has been. So I think what people are celebrating is not necessarily this immigrant story all the time. It's something else. And in fact, something that coincides with, this is what America is. And I say that because of how the presence of audible languages that aren't English were such a flashpoint in the early 2000s. And became a flashpoint in the local media. People didn't like hearing Spanish at all in public.
Sure. I have two questions. One's a follow-up to Faulkner's. Could you say more then about in what ways you consider Williamsburg normative for the United States, and what ways is this exceptional? Is this a unique story, or is it a national story? And then the second question, just as a matter of curiosity, you alluded to a third unstated cause of
Yes.
migration, and I'd love to hear more about that.
That's the third stated cause. So as immigration enforcement got stepped up in traditional crossing points, what we see there is the dotted line or the solid line or the previously favored routes of migrants. So right through Nogales and to Tijuana. And in the 1990s, lots and lots of money and lots of fencing, lots of surveillance technology, and lots of boots on the ground. The budget of Border Patrol right now is $3.5 billion. In order to, the Border Patrol calls it prevention through deterrence. And then in the traditional gateway cities like Phoenix and San Diego, stepped up efforts of the Border Patrol to also encroach in and be able to catch people. And so people were like, there's jobs elsewhere and there's a lot of hassle living here. And so that's seen, there's a guy by the name of Light who wrote this book about how immigration was deflected from California to the southern receiving states. So that's the easier question to answer for me. The harder question is Williamsburg and whether or not it's typical. And my colleague, a geographer at Penn State, and I have been working on this piece because she's done a nationwide study looking at all kinds of new rural and small town settlement sites. She is really has sort of pioneered this idea of the amenity migration of wealthy people. So she's really getting into wealth patterns in the United States, and then the wealthy people moving and buying second homes, or in my case, in Williamsburg, it's retirement, but in places that she looks at, it's really buying these huge second homes. And then that creates this demand for service. So she's been able to track how, and she calls it linked migration streams, which has been identified in cities by sociologists like Saskia Sassen. But Lisa Nelson, has done some really important work. And so we're working on this piece where she's comparing Raven County in Georgia, and we're comparing that with Williamsburg, because usually the rural settlement sites are associated with the chicken production and the agriculture, like Charlottesville. But in Williamsburg, it's a different story. It's the hotels, and it's all services. So the service being the labor draw is one difference. What Faulkner pointed to with regard to sort of the history of the place is another difference. But there are lots of similarities. Like I read the type of folks who immigrate, and that is like a pattern across the U.S. South.
My question relates to how does your study relate to the rest of Virginia, especially Northern Virginia, and then what about the educational opportunities for students who are children of undocumented?
Well, Northern
Immigrant.
Virginia is a different story because Salvadoran immigration. So Virginia is one of the only states in the South where the state of Virginia has more Central American immigrants than Mexicans, last I checked. And that makes it stand out. And that's a story of the 1980s Central American migration to the DC in Northern Virginia. But that's a different story from Williamsburg because that happened in the 80s, was beginning in the 80s, and there's a couple of good books about that pattern. So this is really kind of a different phenomenon from how folks arrived in Northern Virginia. It doesn't mean that things weren't galvanized because migration shot up in the 1990s to the United States, not quite to the highest point in US history, but very close. And places like Williamsburg, well, the US South, really between the Civil War and the Vietnam War didn't see immigration from that part of the world. So, you know, it's not quite the same pattern that you see in Northern Virginia. And those folks have also have a bit more of a foothold, and there's more of a community. And one of the things that I find very gratifying is that I'm seeing increasing numbers of Latino students, children of immigrants, in my classroom. And I'm very happy about that because I think that a public institution should reflect the demographics of the state that it's in. So the only way I can answer the educational opportunities, I mean, I will say, I don't know if you all saw, the General Attorney of Virginia just wrote an advisory letter to public university colleges, presidents of public universities and colleges in Virginia, advising them that adolescents who are under DACA, deferred action, means they can't be removed. They've applied for and received the status created by the deferred action status signed by President Obama, that they should not be precluded from paying in-state tuition if they can prove domicile just like anybody else. So they should be treated like anybody else despite their DACA status. That seems like a huge step forward. That didn't seem possible to me in 2007 when we were having the Prince William County controversy in Herndon and you know, really virulent ways that people talk about immigration that are hardcore. Last thing I'll say before I take another question about this question is a plug for Head Start. And every year there's always like, oh, Head Start doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And you know, I'm not an expert in these kinds of things, I guess, but I just gave the convocation address for Head Start last. It was so fun. The kids weren't there, but I was like, convocation at Head Start, this is awesome. And you know, school readiness is so important for these kids. I went to kindergarten registration, and you know, there was a group of moms, and I went with them, and it was a flashback to when my kids were little. And the little boy that I call Orlando in this story, you know, I'm walking in with him, and this is a kid who had only Spanish at home until Head Start, and blonde-haired lady who didn't speak any Spanish comes out and says, okay, come with me, we're gonna go to the classroom, we're gonna go, while your mom's doing this. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you know, this kid was in an apartment, really isolated for so long. And he's like, okay, it's school, you know, he was totally excited. And maybe that's just an anecdote, but I think that Head Start is a very important program, particularly in places that are just grappling with this new population.
I think we have not begun to exhaust the questions that are raised, both by your wonderful talk and the great questions that we got today. I know this topic will occupy many of us going forward in the future, so thanks for giving us an introduction if it's a new topic and extending it if it's something we know something about. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.